Hey friends, welcome back to Heartscapes, where we're learning the system of Reiki to live lives that are rooted, spacious, connected, and that help us remember ourselves. My name is Michaela. Welcome back to the studio. So this video is a part 2 to the Ask Me Anything video that I released last week. This was in celebration of the channel reaching 1,000 viewers, and we're now at about 150 above that, so it's taken me a little bit of time to circle back to this. But I did want to answer the rest of the questions that you all sent in. There were too many to fit in one video, so here we are, part 2. So the first question that we'll look at for this conversation is, can children learn the system of Reiki? And the short answer is, yeah, definitely. But y'all know I don't go for a short answer. So just a little bit more context. So I think for the most part, I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say that children can't learn the system of Reiki. But there are different perspectives on what that looks like and what that means. So I'll just share mine with you. So the perspective that we take here at Heartscapes comes through the Japanese origins of the system of Reiki. And that starts with the premise that Reiki simply is what we are. That Reiki, or spiritual energy, life energy, is what each of us are. We have it, we are it, we express it from our inside out in ways that are natural and intuitive and spontaneous, that don't require conscious thought. And therefore, we don't need anyone to give it to us. We don't need to be attuned to it. We don't need to be turned on to it. We don't need it turned on inside of us or activated in any way for us to already have a relationship with Reiki, because it is what we are. So then what do we need teachers for? What do we need a system of practice for? Well, we need a system of practice to help us focus our attention and to help us to build strategies to be in more conscious contact with that life energy that we are, and to be in a conscious and consistent state of intentionally bringing those sensations of grounding, of spaciousness, and of connection that help us to fully be in contact with that aspect of ourself. It's always there. We're often not conscious of it. And so with that in mind, children are, generally speaking, of course, this is going to vary from person to person, depending on their circumstance, but depending on who they are, what their experiences have been. But generally speaking, children are much closer, at least in time and in experience, to the kind of state of innocent, open, unquestioned connection to life force energy that we all begin our life with as little babies. When we're born, we are connected, we are spacious, we are grounded, we are in that flow of connection with life. Psychologically and biologically, we can see the way that babies attune to the people around them, to really kind of view themselves and to experience themselves as part of the lives that are around them, and at a certain age begin to psychologically differentiate themselves and kind of become their own person, experience themselves as an individual. And that's a beautiful thing, and also kind of begins that process of putting layers of distraction over that pure connection to life that we begin with. And the system of Reiki, a system of practice developed by people to connect with the phenomenon of Reiki. So making that distinction, the phenomenon of Reiki, of spiritual or life energy, and the system of practice, the system of practicing Reiki, that is a system to help we adults remember that wholeness of our true self, remember that state of connection that we began with, and to activate it and to intentionalize it and to work with it in active ways in our life. Children, as I said, are closer to that time of remembering and just being in the flow of that. So in that sense, they very naturally can be in relationship with Reiki in ways that are more challenging for adults. Part of the challenge in working with kids is that they also tend to be more fluid, more distractible, less interested in systems and structures, like a system of practice. And so, like anything working with kids, we have to make our approach to it age appropriate and to kind of find ways to teach and to have them experience, most importantly, experience the basic foundational pieces of the system that are important, and then let them explore that in ways that are playful. Pardon me. Random didgeridoo movement back there. Let them express that in ways that are playful and spontaneous and, just natural to who they are. There are people who have great genius for working with kids in this way. I am not one of those people. I appreciate kids. I think I'm decent working with kids, but it's definitely not my area of genius. And so I've never directly worked with kids in that way. Even my own kids aren't particularly interested in learning a system of practice, so I haven't pushed it with them. But absolutely, there are ways to make this system of practice very accessible to kids. And when we're, practicing it, from those origins that are very much connected with systems of nature and reconnecting with the natural world, remembering that place that we have in the web of life, kids are just naturally, again, generally speaking, generalization, naturally more able to drop into that. They kind of already feel that in a way that many adults have forgotten. So in that vein, some of the very tangible aspects of the system of Reiki. So, for example, Tenno Hiro practice, using touch, using connection to share Reiki with people, very much something that kids understand inherently, but also some of the more esoteric practices, the way in which we can use our imagination, use our mind to be in Reiki and to be in that space of connection with ourselves and of the world. Again, they have that space of imagination well cultivated, generally speaking. And so, can do some interesting things with visualizations, with practices of the imagination. We remember within the system of Reiki, from its Japanese origins, we work with the concept of Sanmitsu, the three mysteries, or the three mystic practices of the body, the breath, and the mind. That's kind of a fun dynamic for kids to jump into, and again, be creative, create their own practices that help them to be in that flow. So yeah, that's a little bit of an answer to the question of, can children practice the system of Reiki? They absolutely can. Alrighty, so the next couple of questions, it's a pair of questions that we'll look at together, and that is there anybody who should not practice Reiki or share Reiki with other people? And are there people who should not receive Reiki? That's an interesting question that probably has a wide range of ways that we could approach it, a lot of different answers, and some obvious things and some subtlety in there. But just summarizing and taking those two pieces together, if we look at sharing Reiki with others, there are some obvious things that we could look at. One should not share Reiki with others if one hasn't been trained in the system of Reiki. That is distinct from what I just said in the previous answer, which is that we all are inherently connected to Reiki as a phenomenon. We are Reiki. We emanate Reiki life energy as part of who and what we are. And any and all of us can and do engage in that practice in ways that are subconscious, that are intuitive, that are natural, that are of our own design, practices that we have designed. And that is all good and beautiful and should be explored by each of us in the way that is interesting to us. So making a distinction between that form of natural, intuitive being with the phenomenon of Reiki versus practicing or teaching a system of practice that was developed in a particular time and place, following specific traditions, cultural and spiritual traditions, and that have specific embedded aspects to them. And so whatever lineage one follows, so I practice from, as much as I can, the perspective of its Japanese origins. There are many Western forms of Reiki that are really different systems of practice that operate on some very different premises than the original form. whichever lineage one is inside of, there are systems and structures inside of that lineage that define what that system of practice means. And so, again, maybe it goes without saying, but just as a starting point, we shouldn't be practicing something we haven't been adequately trained in. We shouldn't say to another person, I'm going to practice Reiki on you, I'm going to share Reiki with you, or I am doing Reiki, if we don't have that relationship with that system of practice. On the one hand, it's not respectful, it's not in good integrity to be practicing something that we haven't taken the time to develop a relationship with. And it's not effective, right, if we don't actually have the technique and the structures down. Again, making that distinction between that and other forms of intuitive, natural, or self-developed practice that one might have. We just should not call those things Reiki, because Reiki is a specific word, again, coming from a specific culture, a particular context. It means something specific beyond the simple definition of life energy. So we might say, I naturally do energy work, or I naturally work with energy, or, express energy, or I can feel healing energy in my body. There's lots of different language that we can use to describe things that we've developed or that are natural, that without using this term that has a specificity to it that should be respected. So that's the first layer. And then assuming that one has been trained in one lineage or another of the system of Reiki, then we can look at mindset and kind of where a person is in the moment, in their life, as far as whether or not it is a good idea to share Reiki with other people. And so, Reiki, again, I'm speaking from the perspective of its origins as well as I can understand it. And those origins would state that the most important thing, the most important aspect of the system of practice that we call Reiki is our mindset and our focus. Where are we focusing our attention? All of the practices within the system have embedded in them the intention and the outcome of helping us learn to focus our attention in a way that maximizes our clearing away of distraction and our connecting to that inner spark of life, that Reiki that is inside of each of us, that very specific job of moving away distraction and focusing our attention on the seed of life that is inside of us, and then working with that seed of life in various ways. And so if we are particularly distracted in a moment, for any reason, but certainly for reasons that are emotionally intense. For example, if we're grieving, if we're particularly upset about something, we're particularly angry, even if we're particularly excited and anticipatory about something, or we are depressed, or we are dissociated because we've had some, trauma triggered inside of ourselves for some reason. These are all things that will pull our focus away from connection, from being present, being fully, as much as we can in the moment, connected to that seed of life inside of us, which is the way in which we can be with others in a beneficial capacity around the system of Reiki. So that requires, self-assessment and honesty, an assessment of where is my headspace, like where am I at right now with regard to level of distraction. And that's not to say we have to be perfectly laser focused at all times. If that was the case, then most of us could not practice Reiki most of the time, including myself. There will often be, until we get to advanced levels of practice, there will often be some level of distraction, of pulling away, of our own life and our own feelings and experiences being present in the moment when we're sharing Reiki. And so it's a personal determination of, to what degree can I set those things aside and be as present as I can in this action and as focused as I can on the outcomes that we're here to be inside of. And I've had to make that assessment at times and determine that I actually can't set aside whatever this is, and therefore this is not a good time for me to share a Reiki session. But most of the time, in most other instances, that assessment reveals that I can do that, but I'm going to need to do a little bit of energy hygiene. I'm going to need to do a little bit of practice, a little bit of self-practice before I step into this connection with this other person. Oftentimes that's relatively quick. And in fact, most of us who practice Reiki are taught some form of grounding practices or centering that we use every time we begin a session that really help us to kind of set our focus and our mindset that this is where we are and what we're doing right now. And in times when I'm feeling particularly distracted for whatever reason, I might need to do an extra layer of that centering practice. I might need to be running a mantra in my mind that helps me to keep my mind focused as I'm going through the practice. A very simple one, and one that I use most often, is simply reciting the precepts in my mind. The precepts of the system of Reiki, which guide our attention to what the intended outcomes for the practice are. And so that looks like each time I inhale, I say that opening phrase of just for today. And then on the exhale, each of the 5 precepts. So just for today, I anger not. Just for today, I worry not. Just for today, I'm grateful. Just for today, I'm true to my way and my being. Just for today, compassionate to myself and others. And that often is enough to keep my attention focused on what we're there to do and on connection, on presencing. And it also helps me to time myself. 5 breaths, 5 to 10 breaths is usually what I do for each hand placement. So we should not do Reiki if we've not been formally trained in it. We should not do Reiki if we are excessively distracted and we cannot clear that distraction so that we can focus on the task at hand. And then, of course, if we're physically quite unwell, especially with something that's communicative that we can give to other people, we shouldn't be doing Reiki, at least not in person. We should be focusing on our own healing and our own rest and so on. That one also is obvious, but perhaps should be said. I think from there, we could get into a lot of subtlety of like specific case studies of times when it would not be a good idea to share Reiki, having to do with, even things like belief system and, relationship with the other person. That's another piece is, depending on there are times when just kind of a particular form of tension within the relationship with a particular person or any other kind of power dynamics that are unhealthy, those might also be reasons to not engage in that particular Reiki session. When those relational dynamics are troubled in some way, that can affect, again, that connection and that presencing. So I think that's enough for now without getting into really hyper-specific case studies. On the other side, in terms of if there is anyone who should not receive Reiki, this one is a little bit more fluid, a little bit less specific. And in that case, I think it would really depend mainly on the person's mindset. A person doesn't have to fully believe in energy work and energy healing or Reiki as a phenomenon, or the ability for, a person to offer touch and focused meditative attention in a way that will benefit. You don't have to actually believe all of that to be true to go into a Reiki session and benefit from it. But you do have to have a certain openness, right? You have to consent to being in that session and have enough openness to be there. And I've certainly worked with a number of clients who were in that camp who had who weren't sure they believed it, who had a certain sense of skepticism, but were open and willing. And that's actually a really wonderful type of person to work with. I often really enjoy those sessions because that combination of healthy skepticism and openness and willingness can really open up some really fantastic experiences for both of us and some great conversation. So those folks absolutely are great to receive Reiki. But if one is actively resistant, right? If the idea of Reiki or whatever they have in their own mind, whatever perception they have of what Reiki is, which may or may not be accurate, if that perception, strongly contradicts something that is important to them, a system of values or beliefs, particularly spiritual beliefs is often where this would come into conflict, that's going to create a sense of anxiety or resistance or frustration, then obviously that is not a good match, right? There are absolutely ways to have conversations with people who have those kinds of resistances and, talk to them about Reiki in ways that can perhaps soften that resistance, explaining aspects of the system of Reiki that, and why, in my personal belief, they would not contradict certain other spiritual systems of belief, and perhaps soften that person to the point where they would get to that point of openness. And others will not get to that point. Others will really feel that this is just not a good fit for me. And that's perfectly fine. We can be in our own practice with those folks, right? And this is maybe going into another question altogether, and perhaps a conversation for another video. But just to touch on, there are ways to be in Reiki with people who don't want to be actively worked on, that is in integrity, that is authentic, that can foster good connection and benefit for both of us without violating that person's beliefs or consent or their wishes. And the short version of that is that all Reiki is self-Reiki. So if we're in our own practice of, breathing and perceiving and moving through the world in a particular way, we just are Reiki. We are in our practice going about our life, then that radiance of that practice, touches other people around us, because we are entrained to each other. We are social beings. We have mirror neurons. We pick things up from each other. And so, being in a space of calm and connection and spaciousness and groundedness is going to benefit the people around us without us having to actively be doing anything to them or with them that may or may not resonate with them. So a little bit of a side quest there, but related. So yeah, a person should not be forced to receive Reiki or even pressured to receive Reiki if it just fundamentally does not, jive with their belief system. Somewhat related to that, folks can have had negative experiences related to things like Reiki, like energy work, anything that requires them to get vulnerable and intimate with a practitioner. And I've had a couple of times where I have, offered a Reiki session to a person for a specific reason that they were sharing with me. And their response was like, "Ooh, yeah, I've had a bad experience with that. Not for me, not again." And those are, situations that are a bit delicate, but first and foremost must be met with respect of those boundaries, right? That person setting that boundary, saying, "Nope, I have had a bad experience with this," which often involved somebody not respecting their boundaries, creating a session or a condition that did not feel safe for them, or that triggered them in some way that was not either noticed or appreciated or respected. This is why I, teach a class on cultivating a trauma-informed Reiki practice for practitioners, so that we can minimize the potential for those sorts of experiences to happen, because it's happened often enough that I have talked about Reiki with somebody and they have shared back that they have had very unpleasant experiences with practitioners. And what I know is that that's not Reiki as a phenomenon, right? Again, back to that distinction between Reiki as a phenomenon in the world and Reiki as a system of practice. Reiki as a phenomenon is what is inherent in this person that I'm talking with. In all of us, it is their life force. It is their connection to the web of life. It is who and what they are. And, being in conscious connection with that seed of life inside of them can only benefit them. However, systems of practice created by people and enacted on people or towards people, supposedly for the benefit of other people, but can and are sometimes enacted in ways that cause harm, that disrespect boundaries, that, take for granted that people will feel safe and comfortable when they do not, that, use elements that, really should be used sparingly and with another person's consent. And so if we're encountering a person who has had an experience like that and we're offering them Reiki and that resistance is coming from their direct experience that's been negative, that very well may be a person that it's, the negative experience of trying something that caused them harm in the past might outweigh the calming, beneficial experiences. Similar to the person who has a theological or values or belief system resistance to the system of Reiki. This person who has had a negative experience in the past might be able to be brought around with some gentle conversation. But that it'll take care, and it'll take discernment on whether or not it's something that's even worth pushing or pursuing with them. And I would say pushing is never going to be the right thing, but let's say pursuing with them. And usually that's going to take some time. It's like I wouldn't necessarily go into that place of trying to persuade them in that initial conversation, but creates an opening for that conversation to happen in the future. I might say, first and foremost, I'm so sorry you had that experience. You should never have had to experience that. I am aware that that can happen when, we create containers that are vulnerable and intimate. There is that potential for something to land as harmful. And I'm sorry that happened to you. If you are ever curious, if you want to, talk about ways that people can and should enact a session like this that minimizes those things, and specifically what I do to respect boundaries and so on, I'd be really happy to talk with you about that and, kind of create that opening. And then from there, just, depending on the relationship and how often you're speaking with this person, just talking about your work openly but gently, and in more of a just here's what I'm experiencing, as opposed to, yeah, you really should try this. We don't want to go into a space of pushing a person when they've already set a boundary around something that was a bad experience for them. So those are the main types of people just generally that I would say maybe should not receive a Reiki session, or there's reasons to, be cautious with that. Outside of that, again, there could be some hyper-specific situations, but, even if a person has a contagious disease, we can share Reiki with them remotely. We don't have to be in the same physical space with them to share Reiki with them. So that's not a consideration necessarily. Even if a person is in a medical facility and it's challenging for us to offer a session in the conventional way, there are absolutely ways around that, ways of being flexible. So it's very, very flexible when it comes to how we share a Reiki session with somebody, once we've gotten to the point of knowing that it's an appropriate thing for them and that they have openness and willingness and consent. So I think that is a pretty thorough answer to that question. Thank you to those who asked it. That came in from several folks. So the last question that was posed when I invited folks to ask me anything was one that is really quite a Pandora's box of a question. And that was simply, what are you most curious about? And this is the kind of question that I just love in general. Cultivating curiosity is something that is part of my personal practice. It's part of my teaching. It's part of the spaces that I hold. And at the same time, it's a really challenging one to answer because when you open up a question like that, what are you most curious about, to a mind that actively cultivates curiosity, it's like, golly, do we have all day to talk about that? The list is endless. So narrowing that down, let's assume that what they meant was, what are you most curious about when it comes to the system of Reiki? Even that list could be vast. But if I just kind of pull it in for a second and just ask myself in this moment, just for today, what am I most curious about in terms of my relationship with the system of Reiki? So I'm going to just do that right now and ask myself that question. Okay, so what came up for me in this moment, just for today, what am I most curious about the system of Reiki, is actually connected to one of the questions from the first video in this Ask Me Anything, which I'll link down below if you want to check out the first series of questions. And in that video, someone had asked, is there any place, any organization or space or community in the world that you would want to bring the system of Reiki into? And I talked about, my desire for, Reiki, the system of Reiki, or similar systems of practice to be present in all levels of government and all levels of decision making, basically in places that are non-conventional for one to see a system of practice like Reiki being practiced. And in that, I'm really speaking of primarily the meditative, mind focusing, kind of mind, breath, body posture aspects of the system of Reiki. So not specifically talking about Tanahira or palm healing. So I just want to make that distinction because we often, the most common thing that people think about when they think about Reiki is a hands-on healing session. And so not necessarily talking about that, although potentially depends on the where and the what, but more specifically on the self-development, meditative practices that are the foundation of Reiki that have us move towards embodying the precepts in our life. So if we really break it down to the basics, the precepts are the system of Reiki. The precepts describe the outcomes that we can experience when we practice the system of Reiki. They offer guidance on how to focus our attention. And they describe enlightenment, right? This is a practice that comes out of esoteric Japanese Buddhism, Shingon and Tendai Buddhism. And, those traditions, particularly Shingon, holds that we can each attain enlightenment in a single lifetime, that we don't need to repeat over and over again, that we can come to a place of enlightened life and living and being in a single lifetime if we practice. The system of Reiki is a distillation of those concepts and offers us this concise, specific description of what that might look like, what that might feel like to live an enlightened life. And they're described in the precepts. And those precepts are drawn from much more extensive texts within the traditions that go back for a very, very, very long time. And it's this distillation, this simplification, secularization in a certain sense due to historical factors that I will not geek out on at this particular moment because we'd be here all day. But it's this distillation of what that means. And so if we take that as the center point, if we acknowledge that is in fact the center point of the system of Reiki, everything else is designed to orient us towards those precepts. All the other practices, including Tanahira, palm healing, are intended to help us embody those precepts in our life. And so if we look at it from that perspective, I very much am curious about what it looks like in the hypothetical, but then in the practical, how do we get there in terms of bringing practices like this into organizations, communities, spaces that typically do not include things like this? And I am so grateful that my work with Reiki over the last 10 years has included a fair amount of that, of bringing elements of the system of Reiki. I love the flexibility of it, right? We can break it down into things that people really do understand and really do value and can see the purpose of, right? We can talk about the system of Reiki, especially when we root it in its origins, in those Japanese origins. It is so easy. It can be easier than one might think to talk about and work with people on the system of Reiki in ways that don't feel woo-woo, that don't feel, new age, and don't feel like weird and out there to a person who is not in that world. And that's super important, right? Because we all need this practice. I truly believe that it's life-changing and it's world-changing to bring the perspectives that are reflected in the precepts into all aspects of life. And in order for that to happen, they have to be accessible, right? They have to be understandable. They have to be relatable to people who are not particularly focused on practices like this, the people who might actually be resistant to them. And when we can actually bring those practices into, intense, high stress leadership positions, positions where people are really making decisions that impact other people's lives, whether through corporations or governments or nonprofits or community organizations, things change. Things fundamentally change about the way in which those decisions are made and enacted. And I have seen it. I have seen it over and over again in the microcosmic instances where I do have the opportunity to bring the precepts and bring these practices into organizations like that. So back to the actual question, what am I curious about? I'm curious about what are the strategies to do that more, to do that bigger. I know people are working on things like this. There are definitely people who are bringing meditation and other practices into non-conventional spaces. And I'm curious about that. What is the strategy for actively making that happen? Because for me, it's often more, I haven't been invited because I know somebody who's in that organization who wants to, have a different kind of experience. So it's not something that I've been like targeting and going after and creating strategies around, but I would like to. And I don't quite know how to do that. So I'm curious about that. If any of you have such strategies or experiences with bringing Reiki or similar practices into non-conventional spaces, I would love to hear about it. I would also love to hear your experiences with anything that we've touched on in this series. Your experiences working with children around meditation and Reiki and similar things, yoga. Your experiences with kind of discerning when or when not to provide or receive a Reiki session, and any of the other questions that we touched on in the first video. I'd love for this to be a conversation, to hear how you would answer these questions and what additional questions you have. I'll keep making these types of videos as long as people continue to share their curiosity. So that is it for me today. Thank you so much for hanging with me. If you've made it here to the end, I appreciate you so very much. I would really, really appreciate it if you would take a moment to like this video, to subscribe to the channel if you want to hear any more of these topics from me. I am in a stage of actively trying to grow this channel, to make more connections, to be able to share Reiki from the perspective of its Japanese origins with as many people as I can. And that means we have to play the game. We have to stimulate that algorithm and tickle it a little bit, poke it a few times, and encourage it to show this content around. And you, my friend, have the power to do that by simply liking this video, subscribing to the channel, maybe sharing it with someone that you think might be interested. And let me know what your questions are. I'd love to answer them in a future video. And until then, on this glorious week from the summer solstice day, I hope you are deeply provisioned for whatever your day is bringing to you. Thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye.